Greetings and welcome to TH 430, where we are looking at Huebner's chapter on Enlightenment ethics. And so we will be moving through this. We'll be looking at a few specific Enlightenment thinkers, as is always the case with Huebner, but if any book of this nature, the amount of time that we actually get to spend on a particular historical period and the implications is so minute compared to the importance that it plays. Obviously, you know, the expectation here is you will learn more about, the Renaissance, medieval ethics, early church fathers throughout the course of your lifelong learning. Okay, but the same is true with the Enlightenment. Enlightenment is hugely important in understanding how the West thinks today. Okay, the Western view, because of the Enlightenment, is so utterly different than other cultures that did not experience the Enlightenment because of the claims the Enlightenment made and because of this radical shift from tradition to reason. Okay, so that's going to kind of be where we look today in terms of Christian ethics and the implications, but recognize, we're looking at Descartes, we're looking at Thomas Hobbes, we're looking at Immanuel Kant. My goodness. You could spend a semester just doing nothing but reading each one of these guys, not even discussing, just trying to get through the corpus that each one of these individuals produced as Enlightenment thinkers. But with that being said, let us continue on. So the goals here are going to be pretty straightforward. We just want to be able to recognize Enlightenment thinking, okay? So the idea here is if you're reading it doesn't matter if it's a modern, mid-19th century piece or something like that, you can, recognize that sounds like it came from the Enlightenment. That sounds empiricist. That sounds rationalistic. That sounds like something that would come out of the Enlightenment, okay? You're going to want to be able to recognize Enlightenment thought, okay? But then you're going to have to know how to discuss the ways that the Enlightenment still impacts our understanding of ethics to this day. And not just ethics. It impacts everything. The notion that the only true statement could be a scientific statement verified by empirical research, brothers, that's an Enlightenment idea. The notion that you could poo-poo Aquinas or Augustine or Aristotle, because they did not go about scientific inquiry, the way that a modern biologist would is such a product of the Enlightenment and utterly ridiculous. That's not to say that modern science has not given us many good things, but it's understanding the differences in the realms of knowledge and the forms of proof which are appropriate to each. Something we don't get into here. It's more of a critical thinking issue. But obviously, a historical statement is not validated the same way a scientific statement is validated, which is not validated the same way a theological or philosophical statement is validated. And that kind of idea that these different claims would be validated through appropriate proofs was in place through the Enlightenment. After the Enlightenment, science and rationalism were essentially the only legitimate means of evaluating any kind of claim. So let's take a look at the Enlightenment context. We're going to move rather quickly. You have the medieval tradition, which we've been talking about as it kind of evolves through the medieval thinkers that we looked at, and not just them. You've had everyone from Anselm to Scotus, to Aquinas, and then you start getting into Renaissance, and then you get into the Reformation. But by the time you get to the Enlightenment, you see a shift toward empirical and logical thinking. And even the logical thinking was viewed, how do you want to say this, from the same level of certainty that we might now associate with empiricism. So that logical thinking is usually called rationalism. So you have the empiricists and you have the rationalists within the Enlightenment context. But both of them think that through reason and empirical inquiry, you will be able to produce a kind of ideal human situation. All right. So there's this idea of modern skepticism, questioning tradition and ethics and moral foundations. But behind all this, there's this incredible hubris that believed that through this Enlightenment approach, everything would improve. Like, we don't need any of those old categories or moral foundations because the Enlightenment's going to show us what's really real. And we are going to be able to solve the world's problems. So the amount of hubris and kind of this idea of everything's going to turn out positively, it stands behind this. Of course, by the time you get to the French Revolution in the 1780s, it shows that the Enlightenment can be equally as brutal, besides the fact that it paves the way for modern warfare and all kinds of other nasty things. But anyway, we're going to start here with Descartes, 1596, 1650, sometimes seen as the father of modern philosophy. He really focused on what's called epistemology, right? How do we know something is true? So he had a very specific way he went about doing this. And this is what he's best known for. It's this Latin term, cogito, I think, ergo, therefore, sum I am. I think, therefore, I am. So basically, he went through this method of doubting, methodological doubt, until he got to the point of saying, the one thing I cannot doubt is that I am doubting. And then he builds back from that. So he also advocates a kind of metaphysical dualism, i.e., a separation of mind and body, that by the time you get to, let's say, Mindlander talking about the lack of embodied ethics with respect to sexuality, you might be saying to yourself, boy, that sounds a little bit like what Descartes is setting up here. Okay. And certainty as a criterion for knowledge. So, interestingly, Descartes still believes in God. He argued that God's existence could be proven with the same rational clarity as mathematics. However, notice what happens here. You know, the reasoning, this reasoning places the validation of God's existence within the human mind's rational structures, right? So notice the reason why he can affirm God is because he trusts his rational epistemological processes as opposed to ontological claims foundation in God's being. Okay. So this is a tremendous shift, which is oftentimes why even postmodernism, all modern philosophy, a lot of people they'll trace it back to Descartes in his epistemological shift, if we're going to get technical about it. Well, implications for his ethics is obviously you get kind of a turn towards individual subjectivity. Of course, this implication is seen broadly over time. You get a detachment from tradition, and you get a rationalistic framework that accompanies that. All right, now we're going to look at Thomas Hobbes, 1588, 1679, born in England, a lot of political turmoil, including civil war. These experiences kind of influence his focus on peace and security. You know, one of his major works that most people are familiar with is Leviathan. He talks about the state of nature as being solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, right? And so you have to enter into kind of social contracts in order to kind of decide how to kind of get out of that state of nature. So, state of nature for him is not necessarily a good thing. There's laws of nature, rational principles that can guide us towards peace and security. And you need a strong kind of central authority to maintain order. So, with respect to his laws of nature, Hobbes outlined transition from the state of nature to civil society through reason, right? And that's where the social contract stuff comes in, the basic principles of a political society. And so the first law of nature would have been to seek peace, but defend oneself when necessary. Second law, agree to give up some freedoms for mutual peace and security. Third law, honor agreements and covenants. This is where the need for a strong central authority comes in, because you have to ensure that people keep their commitments, right, in order to maintain order. So Hobbes will argue for a strong absolute sovereign power. Only a central authority for him can ensure peace, prevent returning to the state of nature, which once again is solitary, brutish, in short. Relation to religion, Hobbes ties his theory to Christian ideas, suggesting that earthly sovereigns represent God's authority on earth until the arrival of the divine kingdom, the second coming. So these, it's not that these guys weren't Christian, right? They just didn't recognize that in the long term, many of the assumptions they were making about how the universe functions, which shifted away from many of the traditional beliefs, would be the death knell of Christianity within their system. Okay, but like I said, this developed over time, which is why a good study of the Enlightenment is in order for anyone who wants to see how did we become essentially a godless society, or a society where it is easier to conceive of things without a God than with a God. So Hobbes, in terms of, before we get to Kant, Hobbes, along with Descartes, they mark both of them, including Hobbes, mark a shift in ethical thinking by emphasizing reason over traditional religion, or some of the metaphysical foundations that we saw in Augustine or Aquinas, and paved the way for later Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume. So you have the separation here. You can already see it, of ethics from the religious tradition, certainly from scriptures, right? And the rise of secular rational approaches to morality. You get guys like Lessing who start producing critiques of the scriptures because they have non-empirical, non-rational accounts of things like miracles and prophecies. And so you begin to see the scriptures just torn apart, because even though these guys want to maintain Christianity, they think they're doing a favor to Christianity by placing the foundations of Christianity upon rationalistic structures, empirical structures. Essentially, what they're doing is pumping steroids into original sin. The original sin being, there's a God, I am not him, like to, oh, I am God, and I can make the very essence and being of God dependent upon my empirical reasoning and rationality. So in some ways, what a lot of these men did was really remarkable. In other ways, it is difficult to see how they could not understand the religious implications of what they were doing. Okay, we move on to Immanuel Kant, incredibly important Enlightenment thinker. And some people say he kind of marks a move out of the kind of the Enlightenment into the period of idealism, German idealism with Hegel. But that's neither here nor there. So we're talking 1724 to 1804. So he's a later thinker, German philosopher. He is known for his emphasis on reason as the universal foundation for philosophy. Very difficult to read Kant, just because this man can make more distinctions in one page than many authors make through an entire work. And every distinction he makes is unique to him. Okay. What I mean by that is it's kind of an original philosophy. It's not that he didn't utilize categories that were already in place, but he wants to make very long, specific arguments about the nature of reason, the mind, epistemology, and ontology. And so you kind of got to read Kant on his own terms at all times, which makes his works sometimes difficult to access. So he had the notion of, in his famous essay, What is Enlightenment? The idea of dare to know, encouraging individuals to use their own reason. He saw this as essential for the enlightened age, where the public use of reason was crucial for progress. You have the categorical imperative, which for most people, if they know of Kant at all, this is what they know, right? And the categorical imperative says you never use a person as a means to an end. And whatever moral law you want, you can, or you advocate or think you ought to advocate, the way that you judge whether or not it is useful or true or good is by universalizing that law for everyone and seeing what the implications would be. Kant did distinguish between public and private use of reason. So publicly, as scholars, individuals should have academic freedom to express their thoughts openly, right? Privately, when acting within a role, though, like as a clergyman or civil servant, they should align to the institutional expectations, right? So he believed that there should be a tension between freedom and duty. He had this notion of the Federation of States, kind of like a early form of the United Nations, as a way of kind of procuring peace. So this is, he had a philosophical dualism that essentially locks in within Western philosophy and thought the idea that you cannot access the way things are in and of themselves. I'm going to say that again. Kant's critique of pure reason, where he goes into how we can know and what we can know for certain, essentially locks in the idea that we as human beings cannot fully know the way things are in and of themselves, right? So you have this notion of phenomena and noumena. Phenomena happens within your mind. Noumena is the way things are, okay? But the reality is you can't see things the way things are, okay? The most you can be certain of is the way that it is interpreted to you, right? And so even knowledge of the empirical at this point, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist out there, but your knowledge of its existence is always understood through these categories that are inherent to every mind, right? So what you're finding and seeing out there in the world isn't the way things actually are, but the way that they're filtered and interpreted through your mind, right? And so there is this notion of pure reason that allows you to access these things, but there's very little that you can know because of this. So you cannot know God. Now, he does not deny that God exists. It's just that you could never know that. In some ways, that's Christian, because we would say the same thing. But his is being based on notions of reason. And so he talks about certain statements that you can with certainty know based on reason, but they're very, very limited. And so it's by the time you get done with Kant, you essentially have the last effort of an Enlightenment thinker to be able to establish, like, look, reason can give us everything that we want. Also, you'll hear with respect to Kant things like a priori synthetic knowledge, as opposed to a posteriori analytical knowledge. And all of this has to do with the way that the mind works and knows what is certain and not certain. I'm not going to go into all of this, but these are the ways that Kant will move um, from the notion of pure reason into practical reason and into ethical behavior, where by the time he gets to ethical behavior, you have the categorical imperative and the universalization are things that can be based on pure reason. But that's essentially as far as it goes. Um, in terms of legacy and critiques, you have the questioning of universal application of rational principles. Um, so the idea that rationality exhausts, this is just the legacy and critiques of the Enlightenment in general. The notion that you can just impose rational principles in every single part of life and that will somehow generate good results, right? That's shown not to be the case. So, for example, empiricism and science can show you how to make a nuclear bomb. They cannot show you when it's proper to use it. Okay, so there are just places in life and certain questions and certain realities that do not lend themselves to proper evaluation through empiricism and rationalism. Okay, of course, the virtues, the contextualization of virtues like love, they have very little place within the Enlightenment framework. And of course, you have a shift towards individualistic and relativistic ethics. Now, you'd say, well, how can science lead to relativism? Well, very easily. Think of all the concepts that we use to qualify ethical statements: good, bad, right, wrong. Okay. Notice how all of those concepts are unempirical concepts. So nobody says of the law of gravity, for example, right, that is ethical or unethical. All right. Either it's true or it's false. And so all the other terms that we would cluster around it, like maybe we say it's good or these kinds of things, it's all based on the notion of it either being true or false. However, when you talk about something being moral or immoral, as something being good or bad in a moral sense, an ethical sense, what you're talking about there is something that moves beyond empirical qualification. Okay, it implies a larger view of what a person ought or ought not be, along with larger philosophical commitments. But if the only thing that can be true is that which can be empirically demonstrated, well, all of those terms and ideas and concepts that we use to qualify morality are in of themselves subjective. So you see the shift towards subjectivity, view, i.e., individualism, and then relativism at the same time. Okay. Now, eventually, that relativism is going to turn on empiricism, and that's postmodernism. When you have the moral relativity take the same moves that made morality relative and say the same thing of empiricism. So you might say, well, how could that be the case? Well, all data collected by scientists is theory laden. So the data, right, the theory determines the data that you'll look for and the tools that you'll employ to collect that data. So a person can claim that a scientist's desire to undertake a study is subjectively motivated, and that if he was motivated by different factors, he would have different studies and different data. Therefore, even the empirical scientific approach is in itself subjective. That's what postmodernism did. It's postmodernism not because it's just after modernism, but because it rejected modernism in all of its philosophical commitments inherited from the Enlightenment.